Watch him in any room, at any gathering, in any situation where others feel compelled to justify their presence, their choices, their very existence. While they scramble to explain themselves, why they're there, what they do, who they are, what they believe, he remains curiously silent about his own depths. This is not rudeness. This is not arrogance. This is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. This is a profound stillness of someone who has discovered that the most important truths cannot be spoken, the deepest realities cannot be explained, and the most authentic aspects of existence resist all attempts at verbal capture. The chosen man never explains himself because he has awakened to a fundamental understanding. Explanation is the language of the unawakened, the currency of those still trapped in the illusion that words can bridge the unbridgeable gap between one consciousness and another. He has learned that those who truly understand require no explanation, while those who don't understand will not be satisfied by any explanation. In this recognition lies the birth of his unshakable silence about the things that matter most. The recognition phase. He begins to see the futility of explanation. It begins with small observations. He notices how people exhaust themselves trying to make others understand their perspectives, their choices, their experiences. He watches friends spend hours explaining why they left a job, why they ended a relationship, why they believe what they believe, only to be met with blank stares, quick judgments, or well-meaning but completely irrelevant advice. He sees the pattern everywhere. The desperate human need to be understood, coupled with the tragic human inability to truly understand anything beyond the narrow confines of one's own experience. People explain themselves endlessly, not because it works, but because they haven't yet realized it doesn't work. He remembers his own years of explanation, the exhausting attempts to make others see what he saw, feel what he felt, understand what he understood. The presentations, the arguments, the careful articulations, the patient repetitions. And slowly, inevitably, the dawning recognition that he was speaking a language his listeners couldn't hear, describing colors to people who saw only in black and white. The awakening comes gradually. Explanation is not communication, but performance. When someone demands that he explain his choices, they're rarely seeking understanding. They're seeking confirmation of their own worldview, ammunition for their judgments, or raw material for their gossip. He begins to see that the compulsion to explain oneself is rooted in the deep fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or judged. But this fear assumes that others' understanding is necessary for one's own validity, that external approval determines internal worth, that being known by others is somehow essential for knowing oneself. The great experiment, when words fail the wordless, he decides to test his growing understanding. In conversations where others expect explanation, he offers silence. When asked to justify his choices, he simply doesn't. When pressed to defend his perspective, he smiles and changes the subject or quietly excuses himself. The results are immediate and illuminating. Some people become frustrated, interpreting his silence as rudeness or superiority. Others become curious, sensing something deeper in his refusal to engage in the familiar dance of explanation and justification. A few become uncomfortable, as if his silence holds up a mirror to their own compulsive need to explain themselves. But something remarkable happens within him. The energy that was once dissipated through explanation begins to collect, to concentrate, to transform into something far more valuable than words. He discovers that silence is not the absence of communication, but its most refined form. He learns that his presence speaks louder than his words ever did. His actions communicate more clearly than his explanations ever could. His being expresses more authentically than his descriptions ever managed. The liberation is profound. No longer does he need to translate his inner experience into language that inevitably distorts it. No longer does he need to package his truth into forms that others can digest. No longer does he need to seek permission for his existence through the approval of those who could never fully understand it anyway. The deepening understanding, why explanation is impossible. As his experiment continues, deeper truths reveal themselves. He realizes that the most important aspects of human experience, love, beauty, mystery, the sacred, the awakened state itself, exist beyond the reach of language. They can be lived, felt, embodied, but never adequately explained. How do you explain the taste of water to someone who has never been thirsty? How do you explain color to someone born blind? How do you explain consciousness to someone who mistakes their thoughts for reality? The answer is simple. You don't. You can only be what you are and allow others to recognize it or not, according to their own capacity for recognition. He understands now why the great sages spoke in paradoxes, why mystics resorted to poetry, why the wisest teachers often responded to questions with silence or with other questions. They weren't being evasive. They were pointing to the limitation of explanation itself. The deepest truths cannot be explained because they are not concepts but realities. They cannot be understood intellectually because they transcend the intellect. They cannot be grasped through thought because they exist in the space between thoughts, in the silence between words, in the awareness that witnesses all experience without being captured by any particular experience. He sees that his refusal to explain himself is not withholding information, but acknowledging truth. The most authentic part of himself, his deepest knowing, his essential nature, his connection to the mystery of existence, cannot be reduced to explanations without losing their essence entirely. The social pressure, when others demand explanations, but the world doesn't easily accept his silence. Friends, family, colleagues, acquaintances, they all have expectations, assumptions, demands. They want to know why he makes the choices he makes, believes what he believes, lives as he lives. His refusal to explain becomes a source of friction, misunderstanding, and sometimes conflict. Some interpret his silence as arrogance. He thinks he's too good to explain himself, they say. Others see it as disrespect. He doesn't care enough about us to help us understand. Still others view it as weakness. He can't defend his choices because he knows they're wrong. The pressure can be intense. Social conditioning runs deep, and the expectation that people will explain themselves is woven into the fabric of human interaction. To refuse explanation is to break an unspoken social contract, to step outside the normal rules of engagement, to challenge the very foundations of how people relate to each other. Family gatherings become particularly challenging. Relatives who haven't seen him in months or years want updates, explanations, justifications for his life choices. When he offers only gentle deflections or honest acknowledgments that his path might not make sense to them, the disappointment is palpable. Romantic relationships face their own trials. Partners often interpret his refusal to explain his deepest experiences as emotional unavailability or a lack of intimacy. They want to understand him completely, to know all his thoughts and feelings, to have access to every corner of his inner world. His insistence that some things cannot be explained feels like rejection to those who mistake explanation for connection. Professional environments present their own pressures. Colleagues expect him to justify his methods, defend his decisions, explain his reasoning. When he simply does his work well and lets the results speak for themselves, it can be interpreted as lack of teamwork or poor communication skills. The misunderstanding deepens. What others cannot see. The more he refuses to explain himself, the more others create their own explanations for his behavior. And because they can only understand through the lens of their own experience, their explanations often miss the mark entirely. They assume his silence comes from pride when it actually comes from humility. The humility of recognizing the limitations of language and the impossibility of truly conveying one's deepest experiences to another. They assume his refusal to justify his choices comes from stubbornness, when it actually comes from wisdom. The wisdom of understanding that authentic choices arise from an inner knowing that cannot be adequately explained to those who haven't developed their own capacity for such knowing. They assume his unwillingness to defend his beliefs comes from uncertainty, when it actually comes from certainty. The certainty that truth needs no defense, that reality requires no justification, that what is real will prove itself through its own existence rather than through arguments or explanations. The irony is profound. In not explaining himself, he becomes more mysterious, more intriguing, more compelling than he ever was when he tried to make himself understood. His silence creates a space that others feel compelled to fill with their own projections, fantasies, and interpretations. Some become obsessed with understanding him, as if cracking his code would unlock some secret to existence itself. Others dismiss him as pretentious or aloof, protecting themselves from the discomfort of encountering someone who operates by different rules. A few recognize something familiar in his silence, a quality they sense within themselves but haven't yet learned to honor. The clarity phase, the truth behind the silence. In the quiet of his own presence, away from the demands and expectations of others, he understands with crystal clarity why explanation has become impossible for him. It's not that he has nothing to say. It's that he has everything to say, and words are simply inadequate to the task. He has touched something within himself that is so vast, so profound, so immediate that any attempt to explain it would be like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. The reality he has discovered is not a concept that can be communicated, but a living presence that can only be embodied. When people ask him why he meditates, he could speak about inner peace, clarity of mind, or spiritual development. But these words would miss the essence entirely, the wordless communion with existence itself. The dissolution of the boundary between self and cosmos, the recognition of what was never born and will never die. When they asked him why he chooses solitude over social gatherings, he could mention the exhaustion of meaningless conversation or the preference for authentic connection. But how could words convey the richness of silence, the fullness of his own company, the nourishment he finds in simply being present to what is? When they question his unconventional choices, his lack of ambition for traditional success, his indifference to others' opinions, his strange peace in the midst of uncertainty, what explanation could capture the freedom that comes from realizing that none of these things were ever real requirements for happiness? The truth is that he has stopped explaining himself not because he doesn't want to be understood, but because he has realized that the understanding they seek is not the understanding that matters. They want to understand his choices, but understanding his choices would tell them nothing about the chooser. They want to understand his beliefs, but understanding his beliefs would reveal nothing about the believer. The liberation of wordless being. In accepting the impossibility of explanation, he discovers an unexpected freedom. No longer bound by the need to make himself understood, he becomes free to simply be. No longer constrained by others' ability to comprehend his experience, he becomes free to live from the fullness of that experience without apology or justification. This freedom expresses itself in countless small ways. He stops over-explaining his decisions at work, allowing his competence to speak for itself. He stops justifying his lifestyle choices to family members, trusting that a contentment is evidence enough of their validity. He stops defending his perspective in debates, recognizing that those who are ready to hear will hear, and those who aren't ready cannot be convinced through argument. The energy that was once scattered through endless explanations begins to concentrate into something far more powerful: presence. When he speaks, his words carry weight not because they're backed by elaborate justifications, but because they arise from silence, from depth, from direct experience rather than borrowed concepts. People begin to notice something different about him, though they may not be able to articulate what it is. There's a quality of authenticity that can't be manufactured, a depth that can't be performed, a peace that can't be explained. In a world full of people trying to convince others of their worth, his lack of need for validation stands out like a lighthouse in the fog. He discovers that not explaining himself doesn't make him less communicative. It makes his communication more refined. Like a musician who learns that the spaces between notes are as important as the notes themselves, he learns that what he doesn't say often communicates more powerfully than what he does say. The transformation of relationships beyond the need for understanding. As his practice of not explaining himself deepens, his relationships undergo a profound transformation. Those who were drawn to him primarily for entertainment, validation, or the satisfaction of understanding him begin to fade away. What remains are connections based on something deeper than mutual comprehension. He discovers that the most meaningful relationships are not built on understanding each other, but on accepting each other beyond understanding. The people who remain in his life are those who can appreciate mystery, who can love without needing to know everything, who can relate to his essence rather than just his explanations. With these deeper connections, communication becomes more subtle, more intuitive, more alive. Conversations move beyond the exchange of information to something more like shared exploration of reality. Silence becomes as valuable as speech, presence as important as words, being together as meaningful as talking together. He learns that true intimacy has nothing to do with explaining oneself and everything to do with being oneself, completely, authentically, without apology or justification. The people who love him don't need him to explain his depths because they recognize those depths within themselves. The people who can't love him without explanation aren't capable of the kind of love that nourishes the soul anyway. This doesn't make him cold or indifferent to others' need for understanding. He simply recognizes that his role is not to satisfy their curiosity about him, but to be himself so completely that those who are ready for authentic connection will recognize him, while those who are not ready will naturally seek connection elsewhere. The deeper teaching, what silence conveys, in his refusal to explain himself, he becomes a teacher without trying to teach. His silence about his own depths points others toward their own depths. His refusal to justify his existence invites others to question whether they need justification for theirs. His comfort with being misunderstood suggests the possibility of finding validation from within rather than from others' opinions. Without saying a word about it, he demonstrates that it's possible to live authentically without needing others' approval or understanding. Without lecturing about it, he shows that peace comes not from being known by others but from knowing oneself. Without preaching about it, he embodies a truth that the most important aspects of existence transcend explanation. Some people find this deeply threatening because it challenges their fundamental assumptions about human relationships. If connection doesn't require complete mutual understanding, if love doesn't depend on explanation, if authenticity doesn't need justification, then what are all their efforts to make themselves understood actually for? Others find it deeply liberating because it gives them permission to stop the exhausting work of trying to make themselves understood by those who lack the capacity for such understanding. It suggests that they too can live from their own center, make choices from their own wisdom, and find peace in their own being without needing external validation or comprehension. His silence becomes a mirror in which others see their own relationship to explanation. Those who are uncomfortable with his refusal to explain himself often recognize their own compulsive need to explain themselves. Those who are intrigued by his self-contained peace begin to question whether they've been seeking understanding in the wrong places. The paradox of influence, teaching through not teaching. The strangest thing happens as he continues to refuse explanation. His influence grows rather than diminishes. People become more interested in him, not less. His silence creates a space that draws others in rather than pushing them away. His refusal to convince anyone of anything makes his way of being more compelling than any argument could. This is a paradox of authentic power. The less he tries to influence others, the more influential he becomes. The less he tries to make himself understood, the more others want to understand. The less he explains his choices, the more others question their own choices. He realizes that explanation is actually a form of weakness disguised as helpfulness. When someone constantly explains themselves, they reveal their dependence on others' approval and understanding. When someone refuses to explain themselves, they demonstrate their independence from external validation. But this refusal to explain is not the same as being secretive, mysterious for mystery's sake, or deliberately obtuse. He's perfectly willing to share practical information, discuss ideas, or explore questions together. What he won't do is reduce his essential being to concepts that others can grasp intellectually. The distinction is crucial. He will share his experience but not explain his existence. He will discuss his observations but not defend his essence. He will engage in exploration but not in justification. This creates a quality of interaction that is both more honest and more mysterious than conventional social exchange. The wisdom of seasons, when to speak and when to remain silent. Through his practice of not explaining himself, he develops a refined sensitivity to when speech serves and when silence serves. He learns that there are times for sharing and times for withholding, times for openness and times for containment, times for expression and times for preservation of the inexpressible. With those who are genuinely curious and ready to explore rather than judge, he may offer glimpses of his understanding, not as explanations, but as invitations to their own exploration. With those who are seeking ammunition for criticism or gossip, he offers only polite deflection. With those who are trying to reduce him to categories they can understand, he gives them nothing to work with. This discernment isn't based on judgment of others, but on practical wisdom about what serves the moment. Just as a gardener knows which plants need water and which need to dry out, he knows which interactions call for sharing and which call for silence. He recognizes that some people are in seasons of their lives where they need to talk, to explain, to work things out verbally. He doesn't judge this or try to convert them to his way of being. He simply doesn't participate in what doesn't serve his own season of existence. His season is one of depth, of integration, of living from the wordless understanding that transcends explanation, like a deep well that offers pure water to those who come to drink, but doesn't advertise its presence to those who aren't thirsty. He makes himself available to authentic seekers while remaining hidden from casual curiosity. The art of presence, communication beyond words. In learning not to explain himself, he discovers forms of communication that are far more powerful than explanation. His presence itself becomes a form of dialogue. His way of being becomes a kind of teaching. His existence itself becomes a transmission of possibilities that others might not have imagined. When he enters a room, something shifts, not because he announces his presence or explains its significance, but because he embodies a different way of being human. Without saying anything about peace, he radiates peace. Without teaching about authenticity, he demonstrates it. Without preaching about freedom, he lives it. This is communication at its most refined, being so completely yourself that others cannot help but be affected by your presence. It requires no words, no explanations, no justifications. It operates at the level of being rather than thinking, presence rather than concept, reality rather than description. People often struggle to articulate what they sense in him because it operates beyond the realm of the articulatable. They might say he seems centered or peaceful or authentic. But these words are just fingers pointing at a moon they cannot capture in language. What they're sensing is the presence of someone who has stopped apologizing for his existence and started living it fully. This doesn't mean he's always silent or withdrawn. He can be playful, engaging, even talkative when the situation calls for it. But underneath all his various expressions is an unshakable core that needs nothing from others and therefore has everything to offer them. The ultimate understanding, beyond self and explanation, as his journey deepens. Even the sense of being someone who doesn't explain himself begins to dissolve. He realizes that there was never actually a self to explain in the first place. What he thought was his individual existence was actually the cosmic dance of consciousness expressing itself through the form of his apparent personality. This recognition brings the deepest peace of all. If there's no separate self to begin with, then the whole question of explanation becomes moot. What would explain what to whom? All apparent individuals are expressions of the same underlying reality, temporary waves on the infinite ocean of being. From this perspective, the need for explanation reveals itself as based on the illusion of separation. We think we need to explain ourselves to others because we believe we are truly separate from others. But when the illusion of separation dissolves, the compulsion to bridge the imaginary gap through explanation dissolves with it. This doesn't make him indifferent to others or incapable of practical communication. It simply means that his identity is no longer invested in being understood, accepted, or approved by others. He can engage with others freely because he doesn't need anything from the engagement other than the simple joy of consciousness meeting itself in apparent multiplicity. The chosen man never explains himself because he has discovered that there is no separate self to explain, no others who are truly separate enough to require explanation, and no gap between self and other that explanation could bridge even if it existed. The gift of non-explanation, service through silence. In his refusal to explain himself, he offers others a profound gift, though few recognize it as such initially. He gives them the opportunity to relate to mystery, to encounter someone who cannot be reduced to their concepts, to experience the presence of depth that doesn't perform itself for their understanding. This is a form of service that the world rarely recognizes because it looks like withholding. But what he's actually withholding is the illusion that explanation equals connection, that understanding equals love, that being known equals being valued. By refusing to explain himself, he forces others to relate to him as he actually is rather than as their concept about him. This can be uncomfortable for those who prefer the safety of categories and explanations, but it's liberating for those who are ready to encounter reality beyond their mental frameworks. His silence about his depths preserves a mystery that keeps those depths alive. Just as explaining a joke kills the humor, explaining the unexplainable kills the wonder. By protecting the wordless aspects of his being from the violence of explanation, he keeps alive something precious that our over-explained world desperately needs. Some people will always find this frustrating or threatening, but others will find in his non-explanation an invitation to discover their own unexplainable depths, their own wordless wisdom, their own capacity for being rather than constantly explaining their being. The ripple effect. Others learn the art of non-explanation. Without teaching it directly, his example begins to influence others. People who spend time around him start to notice their own compulsive need to explain themselves. They begin to question whether all their explaining actually serves them or connects them to others in meaningful ways. Some discover that when they stop over-explaining their choices, they become more confident in those choices. When they stop trying to justify their existence to others, they become more at peace with that existence. When they stop seeking understanding from those who lack the capacity to understand, they become free to live from their own deepest understanding. This creates ripples that spread far beyond his immediate circle. People who learn to value their own depths over others' opinions of those depths become teachers of authentic living, even if they never speak about it directly. Like him, they teach through being rather than through explaining. A kind of silent revolution begins, not organized or proclaimed, but organic and undeniable. More people begin to trust their own inner knowing over external validation. More people begin to choose authenticity over acceptance. More people begin to value being understood by themselves more than being understood by others. This is how real transformation happens. Not through convincing people to change, but through embodying change so completely that others cannot help but be affected by its presence. The chosen man who never explains himself becomes a catalyst for others to discover their own unexplainable essence. The final recognition, explanation as love of illusion. In the deepest moments of silence, he recognizes that the entire human fascination with explanation is rooted in love. Love of the illusion of separation, love of the drama of misunderstanding, love of the complexity that makes simple truth seem profound. Explanation exists because we love our stories about reality more than reality itself. We love the idea that we are separate beings who need to communicate across the void of our isolation. We love the fantasy that words can capture what is ultimately wordless, that concepts can contain what is ultimately inconceivable. But this love of illusion, while poignant and understandable, ultimately serves to keep us trapped in the very separation that creates the need for explanation in the first place. The more we try to explain ourselves to others, the more real the illusion of separation becomes. The more we seek understanding from others, the more we confirm that we are separate from them. His refusal to explain himself is not a rejection of others, but a recognition that what they're seeking through explanation, true connection, authentic love, genuine understanding, can only be found by going beyond explanation to the source from which all apparent individuals arise. This source needs no explanation because it is what gives rise to all explanations. It requires no understanding because it is the very capacity to understand. It seeks no connection because it is a field in which all apparent connections appear and dissolve. The chosen man never explains himself because he has found that which needs no explanation, understood that which transcends understanding, and connected with that which was never separate to begin with.
The eternal silence, beyond all words and reasons. And so he continues on his pathless path, carrying within him the wordless wisdom that no explanation could convey. He moves through the world like water flowing around rocks, not in conflict with the obstacles of others' need for explanation, but not moved by them either. His silence has become so natural that he no longer thinks of himself as someone who refuses to explain himself. He simply is, and being requires no justification, no explanation, no defense. Like the sun that shines without explaining why, like the ocean that flows without justifying its movement, he exists without apology. Those who need explanations find them elsewhere or learn to live without them. Those who can appreciate mystery find in him a companion who honors the unexplainable. Those who are ready to go beyond words discover in his presence an invitation to explore the wordless dimensions of their own being. His life becomes a living koan, a walking meditation, a breathing demonstration of what becomes possible when someone stops trying to make themselves understood and starts allowing themselves to simply be understood, not by others, but by existence itself. In the end, he discovers that the chosen man never explains himself, not because explanation is wrong or unnecessary, but because the deepest truths explain themselves through their own existence. Reality needs no defense because it is self-evident to those who have eyes to see. Authenticity requires no justification because it is its own validation. And in this final understanding, even the concept of being chosen dissolves. There is no chosen man, no explanation, no refusal to explain. There is only this, immediate, intimate, indefinable, the eternal presence that was never born and will never die, expressing itself through the temporary form of apparent individuality while remaining forever beyond all categories, concepts, and explanations. This is why the chosen man never explains himself, because in the deepest truth, there is no self to explain and no other to explain to. There is only the one appearing as the many. Silence appearing as words, mystery appearing as the familiar dance of seeking and finding, understanding that was never lost and never separate from the seeker. In this recognition, explanation reveals itself as the most beautiful and unnecessary thing in the universe. A love song that separation sings to itself, a dream that consciousness dreams while never actually sleeping, a game that the one plays while never actually becoming two. And the chosen man, no longer needing to be chosen or to be a man or to refuse explanation, simply rests in the silence that gives birth to all words and remains untouched by any of them.